Hello there. The Beatles are one of my all-time favourite bands, but of course they're also the most commercially successful band of all time. They're one of the most influential bands of all time, one of the most critically acclaimed bands of all time. And so as expected, when a band is that iconic and that legendary, a big question that always comes up is, what would have happened if they'd never broken up? Like, their breakup in of itself is considered a hugely historic moment in the history of pop culture. So the question's raised, if the band was that incredible when they were together, what new, amazing, legendary, revolutionary music would have come out if they never broke up, if they just kept at it forever, or at least right throughout the 1970s? And one of the main things that spurred on this thought for me is hearing about the concept of the Beatles' The Black Album, the name obviously being a spin on the Beatles' The White Album. The concept comes from the film Boyhood, but I've also heard it talked about in a Sky Arts documentary, and the basic idea is to take tracks from the Beatles solo albums and putting them all together to try and create your own sort of compilation of what it would have sounded like if the Beatles had kept together, as in if they'd kept going, which tracks from their solo albums would have made it onto the end result Beatles albums. So in this quick video I'll basically be discussing what I personally think the Beatles would have sounded like had they stayed together, using the tracks from their solo records as evidence for this, as well as reflecting on the Beatles albums in the lead up to their breakup, and then using this information to formulate what my personal Beatles Black Album or Black Albums would sound like and what Beatles tracks from the solo albums would be on it. So with no riffraff and getting right to the point, what would the Beatles have sounded like if they'd stayed together during the 70s? Drum roll please, Ringo. Exactly the same. Except obviously a lot more streamlined, neater and sleeker. And kept to just the obvious highlights. Yes, it is a fair bit anticlimactic, but when I've been listening to the last few Beatles albums compared to the first few solo albums, there's quite a few sonic similarities that I noticed flowed from one straight into the other, which hinted that their direction on their solo albums would have been roughly the same if they'd stayed together, as indicated by the last few Beatles albums. Like, one of the first things that strikes me on the first few solo albums, particularly those in 1970, so basically McCartney, Plastic Ono Band and All Things Must Pass, the main thing that strikes me is the distinctly acoustic sound, which I think very much helps draw on the idea that this is a solo album. Not only does it draw on the personal aspect, but also the idea that this is the Beatles individually, each as of themselves, to keeping it mainly to themselves, not just in the fact that it's them solo, but also the instrumentation, literally just them on an acoustic guitar for a lot of the tracks. And so I thought, oh, this is a distinctly solo phenomenon then. But the Beatles were aiming to go more acoustic anyway, because when I've been reading about the history of the album Let It Be, the group originally intended it to be an acoustic album entitled Get Back. The idea of it being purely the Beatles themselves, them getting back to their more supposedly more authentic roots after all the psychedelic dabblings and increased technological production focus. However, due to the struggles of the Beatles holding it together at this tense period, it took a while for the album to be fully completed, and so a lot of the work was put in the hands of producer Phil Spector, who was the one that then added all the additional orchestra and choir, which Paul McCartney personally absolutely hated and was one of the things that added to him leaving the group. So much so was the intention for this album to be acoustic that years later there's actually been a remastered, re-edited edition of the demos called Let It Be Naked to sort of try and have a version of the album that's closer to what the band actually intended, keeping it fully acoustic and stripped back. So the largely acoustic sound of the first few solo albums would have been a part of the Beatles sound anyway, as indicated from where they had originally intended Let It Be or Get Back to originally go. Alongside this is the fact that even though we call them the Beatles solo albums, the Beatles solo period, the collapse and destruction and all-round annihilation of the Beatles, a lot of the members were still working with each other. Ringo Starr played drums on Lennon's Plastic Ono Band and the first two George Harrison solo albums. George Harrison played guitar on Imagine and the Instant Karma single. And every single Beatles member had a backing band, backing vocal or songwriting credit on Ringo Starr's mid-70s solo albums. So I guess the only exception then is Paul McCartney's solo albums, where the first two were literally entirely him and Linda, and then the rest, of course, with the Wings as the backing band instead. But this doesn't change the fact that the Beatles' solo period isn't quite as solo as you might have first thought. So I guess that sounds a little bit disappointing, like one of the biggest what-ifs in all music history. What if the Beatles stayed together in the 70s? Well, they would have sounded exactly the same. But there is one major change which I'd point out, is that I reckon it would sound the same, but a whole lot sleeker, like a whole lot better in album form, a whole lot more cut back down to the best bits, because one of the main things you hear when it comes to the Beatles solo albums is they're never quite held in the same reverence as the Beatles albums, and I reckon part of that is they aren't considered great albums through and through, as in there are some absolutely incredible decade-defining tracks in there, like obviously on John Lennon's Imagine you've got the title track, on McCartney you've got Maybe I'm Amazed, but then if you kind of have a look at the track list outside of that, because even though there are some absolutely fantastic album tracks on some of them, like on Imagine I absolutely love Oh Yoko, How and Oh My Love, generally the Beatles solo albums are considered as singles-led projects, as in you remember the main hit singles, but then a lot of the album tracks are just considered quite forgettable filler, whereas with the Beatles albums they're considered great albums through and through. You got the great catchiness in the actual hit singles, but then the sheer sonic creativity and variance in each of the album tracks. And yes, this half of the video has been filmed on a different day. It's like a Razorhead. It's taken 7 years to make, I bet. In my opinion, this seems to be one of those cases where, even though each band member was a fantastic musician, each in their own right, this seemed to be one of those cases where they worked better under the constraints and structure of a band. Like, take Queen, for instance. Every single member contributed to the writing of at least 3 of their greatest hit singles, yet when each of them tried to do a solo project, none of them did anywhere near as well than when they were with Queen on the whole. So some artists seem to do far better when they have someone to bounce off their ideas with, or to cut down their work, cut down all the filler so that it's kept down to just the bare essentials and highlights. And that's what you would have got if you put each of the Beatles' 70s albums together as a Beatles project, each for that year. So say if the first 3 solo albums from 1970 had all been put onto one album, then from McCartney would have literally just been Maybe I'm Amazed, Junk and Every Night, because obviously he would have had to have shared space with the 3 other songwriters and artists who would have been wanting to get their tracks onto the album. So it would have been exactly the same, but far better and sleeker, because each album would have just been kept to the bare essentials and the best that particular member had put out in that year. Like Maybe I'm Amazed is great, Junk is great, Every Night is great, but it's fair to say not a whole lot of people remember Valentine's Day, Hot as the Sunglasses, Mama Miss America. None of those tracks are really remembered in quite the same manner. Whereas for the Beatles, on say Revolver, you'd have the obvious hits like Yellow Submarine and Eleanor Rigby, but then you'd adore all the album tracks like Tomorrow Never Knows, Got to Get You Into My Life, Taxman. And so here in my uni accommodation, this brings me on to, I suppose, the concluding section of this video. What would I personally put on my own The Beatles Black Album? Well, when you look at most of the existing ones, like the one from the film Boyhood, a lot of them come across as just like compilations or Spotify playlists, like where people have just taken their favourite tracks from wherever in the Beatles solo discographies and just putting them together in one big mix. What I want to do is try and more accurately recreate what a Beatles album would have sounded like had they stayed together during the 70s. And so the approach I would take is taking music from different points in the Beatles solo discographies where they were trying out similar musical styles to each other, so as more to create the sense of a more succinct album on the whole as opposed to a compilation feel, and whilst doing this having a core focus on those lead singles which people remember as the main standouts and highlights from this period, along with the tracks where they were collaborating with each other again to create more the idea that this is a Beatles album on the whole, not just random solo tracks mashed together, as if it is the Beatles still working with each other. So the obvious starting point would be those first 3 core solo albums from Harrison, McCartney and Lennon, which all had this very succinct sound of all being very acoustic, very personal and more down to earth on the whole. And one where I was thinking seemed a bit weird at first when you think how John Lennon's first solo album, Plastic Ono Band, is all about Lennon, for instance, with all the focus on his childhood, growing up in a working class environment, the death of his mother and so on. And particularly weird when it comes to the track God, which actually has the line, "I don't believe in Beatles," him openly denouncing the Beatles, which I thought, that would fit a bit weirdly if it actually was a Beatles album. But then when I think about it, the Beatles did often do a lot of self-reflection or self-referencing and self-analysing, like for instance on Glass Onion on the White Album, so maybe it wouldn't be too out of place, it could just about slip in. But it's especially helped by the fact that it has Ringo on the drums, which more so adds a definitive Beatlesness to it. Then you could have one album with all their biggest pop solo hits all on one album. So one album that's a mixture of Band on the Run, Imagine, and George Harrison's next biggest album, Living in the Material World. Because I think these are good examples of ones where they're leaning in that more pop direction, but without going like, overkill with it in terms of cheesiness. Like obviously it's a bit harder with John Lennon, considering the majority of Imagination is again the more political and personal stuff, such as Give Me Some Truth and How Do You Sleep, but there's also the tracks on it that are more very clearly and definitively singles or chart hits compared to some of the other stuff on Lennon's discography, like Imagine and Jealous Guy, which you could more easily slip alongside the likes of Band on the Run. You have periods where both Lennon and McCartney both had a more of a psychedelic sonic experimentation focus. I'm not classing Lennon's avant-garde stuff because who wants to hear that? I'm talking more about McCartney on Ram, and then Lennon on Walls and Bridges, and some of the tracks on Mind Games, where the trippiness started to go up. Although this is the point where it becomes a lot more harder to factor in Harrison, because while McCartney and Lennon remained quite consistent throughout the 70s, Harrison very much trailed off in the latter end in terms of quality, so it's a bit more difficult picking and choosing bits from his solo career to go onto these albums, so I suppose Dark Horse is maybe the ones that fits better on the psychedelic album. Then you can have the pop phase of the late 70s, which is more, obviously definitively the cheesier stuff from the Wings that came out in this part of the decade, but also some of the points where Lennon started going in a more pop direction, such as on Stand By Me, and the singles which were initially unreleased, such as Free as a Bird and Real Love, which go especially well when you consider they're officially the last Beatles tracks, considering in 1996, in the mid-90s, McCartney, Harrison and Ringo all got these demos from Yoko Ono and added their own stuff to them, effectively making them the last ever Beatles tracks. But that adds further to the idea of the Beatles being together as a whole during the late 70s. And then, of course, you get to the final one, Beatles 1980, with McCartney 2, the first McCartney solo album after he broke up the Wings, Lennon's last major album on Double Fantasy, and probably the last time you can have Harrison as a major influence on an album such as this, beginning to get success again with the hit single all those years ago in 1980, but also of course how he started to have increased success right throughout the 80s with his biggest hit since the 70s. We've got My Mind Set on You in the latter part, which you can factor on, along with of course maybe some of his work with the Travelling Wilburys. And amongst all of these albums, we'll scatter bits and pieces from the first two Ringo Starr albums. Well, I say first two, I actually mean the two that have major Beatles influence in the songwriting and instrumentation. So yeah, a bit of a disappointing conclusion to what is one of the biggest speculative points in music history, but that is just my realistic thought based upon observations from the Beatles' last few albums and what consistently happened across their solo discography as to what their music would have sounded like had they stayed together, and what my interpretation of what those albums would have sounded like is, based upon what they actually put out and the moments during it where their similar styles appeared. So if you want to see these albums in action, click the link to my Spotify below, where I've created playlists to match each of the albums I've just described, well, each of the potential albums I've described here in this video. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe. I see the ever-growing subscriber count on my channel, so thank you to everyone who's joining now. I can tell it's clearly the success of that trip-hop video, which has the overwhelming 1,000 views. But yeah, comment below what your personal thoughts are on what the Beatles would have sounded like if they'd stayed together, what changes you'd make to each of my Beatles Black albums. And yeah, thanks for watching. Have a good one.